Hi, folks. Hope everybody is okay out there. Love to everybody. We're going to just make check out the sermon this morning I did on steadfast in the Lord. I might do a deeper Bible study on that at some later stage. But brother, I did a video on the historical Jesus. It was quite in depth. It looked at Josephus scholarship and Thales scholarship. It was very, very deep. And the brother said, "Have you got anything more simple?" So we're going to do historical Jesus, very, very simple. So, two things: criteria and evidence. Criteria and evidence. So, just to say that I am what is called more of a presuppositionalist in terms of Cornelius Van Til. What that means is, as a Van Tillian, I believe that because the Bible teaches that God created the world, that every fact has to be interpreted in relation to God, whether it be science. I mean, there is a verse that says, let every thought be captive to Christ. So whether we're doing history, whether we're doing philosophy, whether we're doing science, whatever we're doing, everything has to come back to the Word of God. So bear that in mind. Bear that in mind. Now, if we want to play the skeptic's game, and we play the skeptic's game, the skeptic comes undone, because there are certain criteria that secular historians use. And if we use those criteria to ask about who Jesus was, did he die and did he rise again, when we use those criteria, we actually find strong evidence for Jesus living, dying, and rising again. So to make it simple, there are secular methodologies, secular ways of doing history, secular criteria of how to find whether something has happened in history. If we use those criteria, it actually comes better for the Christian than for the skeptic. So here you have the criteria of authenticity. So here you have the criteria of multiple attestation. So if you've got, say, one witness, that's good. If you've got another witness, that's very good. If you've got multiple witnesses, this is strong evidence that an event has happened. So if there's a car crash and someone says, "Oh, I saw the car crash," that's one piece of evidence. But if you say, two people say, "I saw the car crash," that's getting stronger evidence. If you say three people saw the car crash, that's even stronger evidence. If you say 50 people saw the car crash, that's even bigger evidence. So historians use, number one, multiple attestation. Are there multiple evidences for this event? Then there is the criteria of dissimilarity or double similarity. If a saying or event of Jesus is different from the Judaism before him and also the early Christians after him, that is more likely that Jesus himself originated this particular saying. So the criteria of dissimilarity is there something that Jesus said that was different from the Judaism of his time and even different from the Christians? Now, these multiple different criterion, they're not 100% perfect and they can be critiqued. But we're just saying, just for now, let's go with the secular way of thinking, just for now. The criteria of multiple attestation, the criteria of dissimilarity, the criteria of embarrassment. If a saying or event is potentially unflattering or even embarrassing to Jesus or the Christian movement, then it's unlikely it would have been invented. So the criteria of embarrassment, okay? So these criteria scholars use, okay? There is another one, the criteria of enemy attestation. Okay? The criteria of enemy attestation. If your enemies are saying something about you, then, wow, you've got to really think, well, this event happened, right? So those are some of the criteria. Okay, so let's take that criteria and let's apply it to some of the evidence. So outside the Bible, there is evidence that he existed, and it also confirms. This is the article, Evidence Unseen. Now, this is dealing with mythicism, which is a view that Jesus didn't exist and that Christianity was a creation of the ancient religions. But also atheists said Jesus didn't exist. Many atheists, not all, but many. Okay. So let's see what evidence we can find to show about Jesus. Okay, now look, you've got Suetonius, Josephus, Lucian of Samosata, Tacitus, Talmud, Pliny the Younger. Now look, notice our criteria. Okay, our criteria: enemy attestation. They're all enemies of Jesus. Make strong evidence about who Jesus is. Multiple evidence, a variety of evidence. Okay. So some of the criteria are already within this evidence here. Okay. So we have Tacitus, the historian, who talks about Jesus. Cornelius Tacitus, AD 55 to 117, serves as one of the better historical sources for the ancient world. In fact, Van Voorhis states that Tacitus is generally considered the greatest Roman historian. In Book 15, Chapter 44, in his Annals, he recounts Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians in AD 64. We read, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abomination. So it's mentioning Jesus standing. Chris, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius. So here we have a Roman historian not long after Jesus confirming that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate. At the hands of the pure creator, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment again, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world. So here we have amazing evidence that Jesus was crucified under Tacitus. Now, it doesn't say crucifixion, but that's what it means, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius and under Pontius Pilate. Now, the four Gospels say Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We have an enemy attestation and multiple attestation, i.e. in Tacitus, that states that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is very simple. Now, this article goes into the pros and cons of the evidence, but we won't go into that. Now we look at Pliny the Younger, okay? Here's another historian who writes about Christianity and gives us some important information. Pliny the Younger, AD 62 to 113, served as the Roman governor of Bithynia, and he corresponded with his friend Tacitus in his letters. In his 10th book and 96th letter, AD 110, he wrote to the Roman Emperor Trajan, questioning him on how to handle the Christian population. He writes, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. That confirms the book of Acts. before it was light, when they sang an alternative verse, a hymn to Christ. That confirms the Gospels that Jesus is God, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify the word, nor to deny trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate, and then resembled to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Even this practice, however, they had abandoned after publication of my edict, by which, according to your orders, I forbid political association. I judged it the more necessary to extract the real truth with the existence of torture from 2 female slaves who were styled deaconesses, but I could discover nothing more than depraved and excessive superstition. I therefore adjourned the proceedings and betook myself at once to your council, for that matter seemed to me worth referring to you, especially considering the numbers endangered. Persons of all ranks and ages, both sexes, are and will be involved in the prosecution. For this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but has spread through the villages and rural districts. It seems possible, however, to check and cure it. Again, notice that some of the things that the book of Acts talks about, that Christianity spread, it spread amongst a variety of people, rich and poor, that they worship Jesus as a God, which is in the Gospels and Paul's epistles. So, and also it's a reference in a way to the resurrection, because Christians are worshiping as if Jesus is alive. So the basic Christian teaching that Jesus rose from the dead, that he is God incarnate, is reflected in this letter. So this is evidence, data outside the Bible, confirming the basic Bible story. Enemy attestation, multiple attestation. Suetonius, the Roman historian. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus wrote under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, and he was a friend of Pliny the Younger, because the Jews, he said, at Rome caused continual disturbance at the instigation of Christus. He, Emperor Claudius, expelled them from the city. So this is showing that Christians were worshiping Christ at Rome at that time. Evidence, what we see in the New Testament, is that there were Christians in Rome, confirming the New Testament. Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, Flavius Josephus, AD 37 to 100, was a Jewish Pharisee and military commander who had been captured by the Romans before the fall of the temple in AD 70. After being taken prisoner, he began working as the court historian for Emperor Vespasian and adopted a Roman name, Flavius. He gives us 2 important references to Christ. So we have a Jewish historian who lived not long after Jesus, tells us about some facts about Jesus. Number 1, the judges of Sanhedrin brought before the man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law, delivered them up to be stoned. Those of the inhabitants of the city were considered the most fair-minded, who were strict in observance of the law, were offended at this. So, here it's saying James and the brother of Jesus called the Christ, confirming the New Testament. Jesus had a brother called James, and he was called the Christ. Next, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was wrought surprising things. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets have foretold. These and 10,000 under wonderful things according concerning him. So Josephus talks about Jesus. He did miracles. He was called the Christ. The Christians believed he rose on the 3rd day, etc. Evidence, and very much what Gospel of Luke states. Now, there's debates and discussion about bits of Josephus, but we won't go into that. There's basic evidence there about Jesus, okay, outside the Bible. Lucian, the Greek satirist. Lucian of Samosa was a 2nd century Greek satirist, AD 115 to 200. He was highly critical of Christianity. He wrote the death of Peregrinus around 165. Peregrinus was a pseudo-Christian convert who returned to Cynicism and politics, committing suicide on a pre-year the Olympic Games, AD 165. When the authorities placed Peregrinus in jail, the Christian visited him and brought him food. Lucian thinks they were duped by Peregrinus. Van Voorst writes, Lucian's point is to warn readers against the kind of life led by Peregrinus, whose emotionally and theatrically were opposed to the reasonable moderation that Lucian advocated. So, here's the historian, what he wrote. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. The distinguished person. You see, these misguided creatures start with general conviction that they are immortal for a time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. So here's powerful evidence that Jesus was crucified by an enemy of Christianity. We have multiple evidence verifying the New Testament. And it's saying here they worship such a person, meaning that there was a belief in the resurrection. Thales, the Mediterranean historian, Thales, a Mediterranean historian, wrote sometime in the 1st century. His writing does not exist, but Julius Africanus, a Christian historian, quoted Thales in AD 221. Evan writes, the value of this fragment is slight, but it shows that someone in the 1st century knew about the darkness and was trying to refute it. Julius commentating and quoting Thales. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks rent by the earthquake in many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thales in the 3rd book of history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So Thales is verifying that there was a darkness at the time of Jesus, but he's trying to argue it away as a kind of secular scientific way, but it verifies in the time of Jesus there was a darkness when he was crucified. Marabar-Sapien, Syrian. Marabar-Sapien was a Syrian philosopher who wrote a letter to his son sometimes after AD 73. William Curtin dates the letter to the end of the 1st century, though most scholars date this letter the 2nd century because he refers to the Jews as desolate and scattered, which fits better after the Bar Kokhba revolt, AD 135. There is only one manuscript of this letter in existence, dating to the 7th century and preserved in the British Museum. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras in a moment their land was covered with sand? What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that the kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samaritans were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for goods. He lived on the statue of Hera, nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in his teaching, which he had given. So here we have a reference to the Christians following Jesus and AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Evidence about Jesus existing and what the Christians believed. The Talmud, the Mishnah, or the Tannaitic literature dates from the 1st century to roughly AD 200. The Emirate period wrote commentaries on the Mishnah one in Palestine, one larger, more important in Babylon. This expert comes from this later literature. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who could say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Hanged is a reference to crucifixion. So Jewish sources, enemy sources, round about the 1st century, all tell us about Jesus. So conclusion. As we survey the evidence, we discover that mythism itself is a myth. That's it's kind of a methodology atheists often use. Even if we did not appeal to the New Testament documents or the voluminous writings of the church fathers to learn about Jesus of Nazareth, we could still discover a number of facts about the life of Jesus from the enemies of Christianity. These would include reports about the miracle working, his crucifixion under Tiberius and Pontius Pilate, reports of his resurrection from the dead, his followers worship him as God, and the rapid spread of his message of love and forgiveness across the ancient world. Thus, even if we appeal to the hostile witnesses from the past, we discover a clear and concise picture of the historical Jesus. And you've got all the evidence there. Hi, Michelle. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the video. I was looking at an article, so I hope you are okay. So does that help? So that's the historical Jesus made simple. That's the historical Jesus made simple for you. I hope it was a help. I hope it was a blessing. So I'm going to go. I'm going to make another video in a minute, Michelle, Yeshua. I'm going to make another video in a minute. So I'm going to do one on the cults now. I'm going to do one on the cults. So get ready. Okay. God bless you.